Is it a success or mere coincidence? Well, fewer migrants than in 22 have irregularly crossed the English Channel to Great Britain this year. About 20,100 people have reached the southern English coast so far, as the PA news agency reported on Wednesday, citing data from the British Home Office. That is around 20% fewer than the 25,000 in the same period last year. And about 300 migrants arrived on Tuesday. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had announced that he would stop the boats. The falling number of arrivals shows, for some, that his plan to deter migrants with strict laws is working. That's at least what the Conservative head of government recently claimed. Anyone entering Britain illegally should be detained and deported as soon as possible, regardless of the circumstances, and with no chance of ever being granted asylum in Britain. Experts, on the other hand, point out that the weather on the English Channel was worse this year, and therefore fewer people risked the risky crossing from France. Amnesty International's UK chief, Sasha Deshmut, said, "This is another reminder that the government's failing immigration policy is not preventing people from making dangerous journeys to seek asylum or to apply for asylum." Stricter regulation of immigration to the UK was indeed a key promise of Brexit. Since then, however, more people have entered the country irregularly. This is also due to the fact that there is now no longer a readmission agreement with any EU country, because the Dublin Agreement only applies to EU members. But let's talk about this for a second. The Dublin Agreement is an international agreement that regulates the responsibility of examining asylum applications in the European Union. It came into force on September 1st in 1997 and was superseded by the Dublin Regulation, or Dublin II, on March 17th in 2003, and later came the third. I talk about this. The Dublin Agreement is based on the first entry principle. This means that the EU member state responsible for examining an asylum application is where the applicant entered the Schengen area for the first time. If the applicant has previously entered another EU member state, that state can send the applicator back to the first state of entry. The Dublin Agreement aims to prevent secondary migration within the EU. Secondary migration describes the situation in which an asylum seeker, after his application has been rejected in one EU member state, travels to another EU member state to submit a new application there. And Dublin III, which is the current one, is the regulation of the European Union that regulates the responsibility for examining asylum applications in the EU. It came into force on July 19th in 2013, replacing the Dublin II regulation. And Dublin III is essentially based on the same principle as the Dublin Agreement. The EU member state responsible for examining an asylum application is where the applicant entered the Schengen area for the first time. However, there were some significant changes compared to the original Dublin Agreement. The regulation contains a number of exceptions to the principle of first entry. Another EU member state can also be responsible if the applicant has already applied for asylum there or if he has family members there. The regulation contains regulations on cooperation between EU member states when implementing the Dublin procedure. Member states are obliged to support each other and exchange information. Dublin III, of course, is also controversial, and critics complain that the regulation distributes the responsibility for taking in refugees to the EU member states that lie on the EU's external borders. And there is also criticism that the regulation restricts the ability of refugees to apply for asylum in the EU member state where they have the best chances. The EU Commission has meanwhile proposed reforming Dublin III. The proposal envisages that asylum seekers will no longer be distributed on the basis of the first country of entry, but on the basis of their personal protection needs. In addition, a joint reception authority is to be created to coordinate the distribution of asylum seekers. The EU Commission's proposal has not yet come into force, though. It has been criticized by some member states, notably Greece and Italy. And these states fear that the reform will put an even greater burden on them. and don't forget Poland and Hungary. But let's stick to the changes that would come if it comes into force. It would introduce a number of exceptions to the first entry principle. It would bring enhanced cooperation between EU member states in implementing the Dublin procedure. And the proposed reform would now make the distribution of asylum seekers based on their personal protection important. And of course, on the strength of the countries. The EU's Commission proposal to reform Dublin III must be approved by all EU member states. This usually happens through the European Council, which is convened by the head of states and the governments of the EU member states, depending on their structure in the country. 2/3 of the votes of the EU member states are required to adopt the proposals, with some EU member states, maybe Greece, Italy, Poland, Hungary, taking a critical view of the proposal. It's unclear whether and if it will come into force. And in addition to the approval of the EU member states, a number of technical requirements must also be met before the reform can come into force. The EU Commission must issue a regulation that specifies the new regulations. In addition, the EU member states have to adapt their national laws and their regulations to the reform. And if all these conditions are met, the Dublin IV would be reform can enter into force. And this is expected to take several years then. But there are some conditions for the reform to come into effect. And I want to say this again. Consent of all EU member states, the adoption of a regulation by the EU Commission, adaptation of the national laws and regulations of the EU member states, and the approval of Parliament. In any case, Great Britain would again not be part of this agreement since it has left the EU. So it has to deal with its arriving migrants on its own, but on the basis of international law, even if the government likes to ignore that fact. And Britain can no longer send refugees back to the EU after Brexit. This is because the UK is no longer part of the EU and is therefore not bound by the Dublin Agreement. And only that regulates the responsibility for examining asylum applications in the EU. And it only applies to EU member states. So it cannot apply to who? Exactly. As the UK is no longer part of the Schengen area or the EU overall, the Dublin Agreement no longer applies to the country. And this means that the UK has no readmission agreements with any EU member states at the moment. And without a readmission agreement, the UK cannot send a refugee back to any EU member state, even if they entered the UK illegally. The UK has attempted to conclude bilateral readmission agreements with individual EU member states, which they can. So far, however, it has only signed readmission agreements with Albania and Rwanda, and those agreements are quite controversial and have been criticized by human rights organizations, but not with any EU member country. But without a readmission agreement, Britain is forced to house refugees in its own camps, and this is an expensive and complicated task. But once again, that just leaves me to say, welcome to the Brexit, sir. And all the empty promises of the Leave campaign show their face every day in normal day politics. If you want to know more about Brexit or other UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.